Today we're talking about work-life balance in the tech industry. Is it actually as good as it appears? What are some scenarios where it might not be that good? And what are some things you can do to make sure that the company that you choose to work for has a great work-life balance? So let's go ahead and get into it. So as some context, the people I typically talk to are usually career changers who are leaving either a toxic industry or a toxic particular job, or the industry isn't necessarily toxic, but just has a culture of working really, really long hours. And the people I talk to a lot of times are burnt out and they want to make sure that the same thing doesn't happen in their new career. And so this question comes up, is the work-life balance in tech actually good? And I think the answer is mostly yes, but in a few cases the answer is no. So I want to talk about both of those first and then talk about some questions and strategies that you can implement to make sure that your work-life balance is as good as possible. Okay, so what are these scenarios where work-life balance is really good? And I would say this is most of technology. So frankly, I think we, generally speaking, have it really good, especially as engineers. Like doing engineering in a big tech company or even a medium-sized tech company is nothing like being a doctor or being a lawyer or even just, working a regular job, say in retail or something. These tech jobs are pretty cushy, and a lot of times you have great work-life balance, really just working 40 hours a week, maybe a little bit more if you're at the beginning of your career or you're trying to work your way up or you have a big project coming up. But in my experience and in the experience of most people I know, the work-life balance is great, typically not working more than 40 hours a week. The type of business also comes into play here. So for example, I work for an agency, which means that we have clients and we provide them our services. And in that case, it doesn't make sense for people who work for an agency in most cases to work more than 40 hours a week, because the expectation between most agencies and most clients is that the agency will not bill more than 40 hours a week. So in that case, people would be doing work that the agency wouldn't be able to capture the value of. And so it just doesn't make sense. On the other hand, there are product companies, and just because there's a product doesn't necessarily mean that that also doesn't apply. So a few things that are different about product companies is that there may be an on-call phone in case a system goes down, or there may be a product launch coming up where you have to work really, really hard. Maybe you work a bit of overtime in order to meet that. But I've also had experiences in large tech companies. So I worked for a Fortune 500 company as a contractor, and it seemed like a lot of people came in kind of late, left kind of early, maybe didn't get a whole lot accomplished during the day. And so I think it really, really just depends on the culture of the particular place that we're talking about. And I was mentioning depends a little bit as well on the business model. I just mentioned a lot of this comes down to culture. So let's talk about a couple scenarios where maybe the work-life balance isn't as good. So the first scenario that comes to mind for me here is doing a startup. And doing a startup is going to have typically not great work-life balance in the most standard sense for a few different reasons. The number one reason is kind of the value capture, if you think about it that way. So Paul Graham has this great quote and essay where he basically talks about how doing a startup is essentially like trying to compress 10 years worth of value generation into a couple of years. And so the nature of that is that you're just working overtime. You're working way harder than you would be otherwise, or if you had a much longer time horizon to generate that value. And so this leads to the kind of stereotypes that you may be aware of with people sleeping in the office and sleeping under their desk. And these offices typically have, all the amenities and stuff because you're being subtly influenced to try and stay at work longer, all that kind of thing. So if work-life balance is important to you, then I would watch out for this kind of thing as you're choosing jobs. Another scenario where work-life balance may not be great could be at a larger, more established company and not a startup, where the culture is just kind of such that people are expected to work overtime and work very hard and work really long hours. So at really big companies, so let's say, I don't know, for example, Oracle, this could come down to a product level or a per team level. So every unit kind of has its own culture and own expectations. And so it's hard to put a huge, Fortune 500 company in a box about what the expectations are around work-life balance. But the point is it varies, and the balance can get out of whack at startups all the way up to larger companies. So it's important to ask the correct questions to figure out what the culture is like around work and overwork. So as you're interviewing, if work-life balance is important to you, here are a few questions you can ask a recruiter or a hiring manager to try and get to the bottom of what the culture is like around work-life balance. So the first and maybe the most obvious would be, how often do people work over 40 hours a week? And it almost goes without saying, but if the answer is kind of wishy-washy and like, oh, we do, sometimes if there's a big project deadline and, you know, maybe we struggle with that a little bit, that's not going to be a good indication. What I would look for would be something more like, oh, we hardly ever do that. A really strong statement that gives you a sense that the company takes this kind of thing seriously. Another question could be, hey, let's say we've got a project deadline coming up and it's clear we're behind. Are we going to work overtime to meet the deadline, or do we extend the deadline? And the answer to that will also be pretty indicative of the company's stance here. So if they say we never extend deadlines, we're always going to work to meet our commitments no matter what, then that can give you a sense for what things are going to be like in crunch time. But if the answer is more like, you know, we kind of take things into consideration and sometimes we end up extending deadlines, we want people to be, you know, rested and balanced, then that's going to be a better indication in my opinion. Another question, one that is personally very important to me, that is, do people typically take all of their PTO? So if the answer to this is maybe not or not really, then there could be kind of a culture there where it's implicitly understood that you're really not supposed to take all your PTO even if you have it. Now, I consider PTO a benefit just like salary or stock options or anything like that. And so I think it's important to take it if you have it. And so if I were interviewing with a company and they said, maybe everyone doesn't always take all their PTO, then that would be an alarm bell for me. Another couple more minor questions potentially, but I would ask, hey, what do I do if I have a doctor's appointment? Or what do I do if I'm sick? And the answers to those questions are going to give you a sense of whether or not the company's culture is flexible and can work around things that pop up in life as they do for everybody. And if the answer is anything other than like, yeah, you just work it out with your team or you have this allotted bank of sick days, then I think that might be troubling for me. I've heard of companies where it's really hard to get time off if you're sick, or if something happens, you're basically expected to be butt in chair all day from 9 to 5. I think this is changing a little bit now that remote work is becoming more prevalent, but I think these kind of companies still exist out there. And so I have an eye out for those and trying to avoid this kind of culture. The last question here that could be interesting would be, do you have paid leave, or do you have an option for taking leave if people need it? If, say, there's a mental health crisis or a family member that is terminally ill or something like that, I think this kind of option can be really important. And so the point of all these questions is you're trying to get at, are people cared for as human beings? Are we making allowances for stuff that just happens in life as it does for everybody? And are we flexible with that kind of thing? Do we value work-life balance or not? And so if this is something that's important to you, then I hope these questions help elucidate a little bit what a given company's culture might be around these kinds of things. That's all for today. I hope you found this helpful. If you're still here, you'd probably like the rest of my channel, which focuses on software engineering and career development. So consider subscribing. Regardless, thanks so much for watching to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.